Many of us say it's dying we fear, not death. Ron Delbane, nationally known spiritual director and teacher based in Birmingham, Alabama, teaches us that God is present in dying as in living. Knowing this, we can embrace the dying process and be fully there for each other.
In the process of death and dying, it's not uncommon to experience moments for which there are no words. Some people are more aware of these moments than others. Some are afraid of them. Some talk about sensing God's presence. To explore the sacred in death and dying is to be alert to the holy, to be aware of those sacred moments, and to look for the deeper meaning. Grief is a natural reaction to loss. It's an awareness that we have lost something very important to us, and that often leaves us with a broken heart. Living through grief is an opportunity for our spirit to mend and for our heart to become whole again. One of the first parts of living through grief is accepting our feelings. And each one of us lives through grief in a different kind of way. My friend Richard said one time, "Grief can be talked about, Ron, but when you experience it, it's something else." When people are talking about it and you're in the throes of grief itself, you don't even hear the words. Sometimes we're able to experience what the person in the scriptures said, "There is no grief like unto my grief." And those are our words. And yet there are some common points in grief as we experience it. Some of the stories that we will hear will tell us some of those common areas, highlight them, help us understand more of what we share with other people, and give us hope.
A 9-month-old child was being rushed out of the back of the ambulance into the emergency room in full arrest. And the mother was right next to the stretcher. And usually what we do is pull them off to the side to go into a conference room. But she was adamant about going back to the patient room with her daughter. Somebody was intubating the child, another person was doing chest compressions, somebody else was pushing a lot of medications into her. And after about 15, 20 minutes of doing that, the doctor stopped the code and came around and told the mother that they had done all that they could do. And she just let out a tremendous scream and ran out of the room, down the hallway, through the sliding glass doors and out into the parking lot. And the doctor and I followed her, then the doctor dropped out and I stayed with her and we walked and paced in the parking lot for a very long time, and then sat down on the wall. And I was able to sit there with her as she sobbed. And I wrote this later in reflection. One of my questions was, as I thought about this, is where is God in this awful tragedy? And the thoughts came to me. There God is laying on the table. There God is pumping air into her lungs. There God is pressing on her chest. And there God is telling the mother, "I'm sorry, she's gone." There God is sitting in the chair holding her baby, broken. And there God is pacing with the mother in the parking lot. I guess what strikes me is I feel that God is so present, but at the same time seems so far away.
Where is God in all of this? It's a question I have heard asked many times, and it's a question that I've asked myself. It's a question that comes out of the fact that we have been plunged into a state of confusion. On the one hand, we know that God is present with us in the midst of our grief, but on the other hand, God seems absent from us. But confusion is also joined by other feelings, feelings of denial, frustration, loss of perspective, a short-temperedness, intensified emotions, a sense of abandonment, or anger. Let's hear Maggie talk about her twin sister and Eleanor about her mother's suffering.
When I first realized that Libby was going to die, was not when the doctor told me. I had a dream. And I woke up crying from that dream because Libby died. And on my way to work that morning, I stopped by the church and I went in and I decided to argue with the Lord. You know, it's not fair. And I can't live without Libby here. And I did all of that. And I came out and I knew. I knew she was going to die. I didn't know when, but I knew that she was going to.
When I was out running, I remember crying and being very angry with God and saying, what kind of God are you that you are dragging this out with Mother? You know, she suffered enough, and it's just time to let go, let her go, quit dragging this out. And I was really upset and crying and yelling out to God to let her go, just let her go and take her home. It's time to take her home. And there's tremendous freedom in that.
A major part of exploring the sacred in death and dying is looking at all the dimensions of grief. Being able to express our thoughts and feelings is a real blessing. The Psalms are instances where the Hebrew people knew that it was appropriate to bring before God all of their thoughts and feelings. And what a blessing it is when those words are able to become our words. Sometimes, however, grief brings us to places where we feel that we are unable to pray.
And I walked in and my grandmother was breathing very erratically. And it was the same sound that Lee had. So I remember it, and it brought back all of those memories. And so it was a sudden thing for me. Lee, I had a chance to be with him all the weekend. With my grandmother, it was all of 15 minutes, maybe. And I walked into the room, I hugged her, I kissed her, and my mother hugged her and climbed in bed with her and rocked her and played with her hands and touched her hair and made sure her nightgown was just so. With each experience, death is still a stinging reality. Even though Lee's was very peaceful and the music was playing, it still pains. With the experience of my grandmother, it still pains. And I remember after her death, not being able to pray, not being able to have any kind of conversation with God. And I remember going to church saying, I know not how to pray. Give me the words. Teach me now how to pray to you, because I'm mad and I miss her. And I have a vacancy in my soul.
Patrick's story reminds us that no two deaths are alike, and that our experiences of death vary widely. It is important as we move through grief to accept our feelings. What feelings of grief have you experienced? And do you accept them? Grief may have taken you so far into the depths that you fear you may never come back. But that fear itself is a part of moving through the hurt. Once we move through the crying, the loneliness, and the abandonment and anger, we begin to discover that there is life beyond hurting. Here's a letter from a woman in Indianapolis who shared with me about her young son's experience of death. My mother died, and at the funeral viewing, my young son looked into the casket and said to me, "That's not Grandma Gladys." I thought a moment and then said, "Why?" He responded, "Because she's not laughing." And I said, "That's right. The laughing, loving part of Grandma Gladys is with God." And that seemed to be the end of it, and I felt good with the exchange. A year and a half later, our neighbor Gus, with whom my son had spent a lot of time following around and emulating, died suddenly of a heart attack. At the funeral, my son said to me, The laughing, loving part of Gus is with God just like Grandma Gladys, isn't it, Mom? I was floored that he remembered that, because he had never said anything more since my mother's death. I simply responded, yes. This is one way of taking in the reality of death. The following three people share with us how they continue to move through hurt in their grief process, in funerals and in creating rituals. Margaret with her friend, and Rob and Drew with their fathers.
I wanted to go see him laid out by myself, not with anybody around, but I thought that would be hard to do, especially if it's in a church and everybody's going to be there. And finally, when I did get to see him, it's like he's not there. He is not there. This is not the person that I knew.
We planned them ourselves, and we picked, for Dad's, we picked a song, Homegrown Tomatoes. I don't know if you've ever heard of that John Denver song. Because Dad was always growing tomatoes and always passed them around the neighborhood, and everybody knew Dad is having tomatoes. So that was really special. And I mean, I've got that tape, and if I pop that in the car, still to this day, it brings tears to my eyes.
The Little Red River in Arkansas is a river that he taught me to fly fish on. And so the last time that I was home in Arkansas, I took my 2-year-old son, and he and I drove up to the Little Red and just walked along the river and came to a nice, quiet place. And I stood there with him and cast his ashes into the river there on the banks of the Little Red, which to me, I have a lot of childhood memories of running that bank as he was wading out in the river and casting flies into the ripples and to the eddies of the river. Later on that day, my son and I, after we had done that, we walked on down the river, and I went back to the car and got my fly rod, and he and I walked back to that spot. And, I tied on a fly and cast out there. In the first cast, I caught a very nice sized rainbow out of there, and I think he would have been pretty proud of that.
Grief is a process. It's not something you move through once and for all. It comes and visits periodically, sometimes triggered by particular events. For one, it may be a John Denver song. For another, going fishing. For me, it's a hot fudge sundae. My best friend Taylor died 8 years ago, and oftentimes after meetings we would go to a Baskin-Robbins and get a hot fudge sundae. Last month I was doing a conference in Texas, and the evening break someone suggested we go get some ice cream. I went along and we pulled up in front of the place, and suddenly I noticed it was a Baskin-Robbins, and emotions just welled up within me as I remembered Taylor. So for some people, a hot fudge sundae may not be much, but for me, it's ice cream covered with memories.
Dad was always the fix-it guy. He could fix anything. And any skills I have along that way, I picked up from him because he showed me how. So whenever there was a project that I needed some guidance on, I'd call. And there was nobody to call anymore.
Some of the best advice I got was from his minister, and it was that day, and he just came to say, how are you doing? And I just, crying, I said, I'll never be able to get over this. And his comment back was, you're right, you won't. And I found myself pulling out old cards from Alex, pulling out old pictures, and purposefully going through the hurt. Because there is a need. You have a real need to cry, and a real need to go through it. And it's a part of making it a part of you, because it doesn't hurt as much the next time.
Living into our grief does mean that at times there will be no one to call and no one with whom to share. I remember I was flying to California out of Minneapolis, and as the plane banked on the takeoff, we overlooked the military cemetery, bright green in the spring grass with the white tombstones lined up. I said to the woman sitting next to me, "What a sight." She responded, "I just buried my husband there, and I'm on my way back home." And you know, it's not the big things that I'll miss about Bob, but I think it's the little things. It's like sitting watching television and turning toward his chair to share something and he's not there. Or sitting at the kitchen table and turning to tell him something and he's not there. You know, I just don't think it's the big things. It'll be all the small things that go on and on. That is true. The more we live through our hurt, the more we are able to live through our grief. The minister's statement to Brooke, saying that it would never really go away, reminded me of Emily. Her husband Frank had died a year and a half before, and we were sitting talking, and she said, you know, I just can't bring myself to clean out his closet. The more we talked, she said, I've gone in so many times. I'm determined to do it. I open up the closet door, I take out one of his suits, and I just break down in crying. You know what it is, don't you, Ron? And I said, it's the smell, isn't it? She said, yes. Someone's smell just seems to last forever. Well, there are ways that we do move through grief, but sometimes it takes a long time. After many years, Joy was able to move through her grief and see life in a new way.
Grief works itself out in many ways. And sometimes I think we grieve longer than we know. We think we're over something, and we really aren't. For a number of years after my husband died, I didn't have a Christmas tree. But I remember distinctly the year that I decided I could put a Christmas tree up. And it was the day after Christmas, and I thought, next year, and this was almost 10 years after my husband had died. I thought, next year I'm going to have a Christmas tree. And so I went to the sales and bought a Christmas tree ornament or two that was on sale so that I would be prepared, because I'd even given all my ornaments away that we had used through the years. I'd given them to my daughters to use. And in a way, I think I was saying to myself when I gave them away, I won't ever really, truly celebrate Christmas again. And it was a long time before I was able to really know that I could do that. And it's been great joy in putting together a new Christmas tree. I have a much more modern Christmas tree. I don't have all those wonderful memories that my children now have in those old ornaments that we lovingly put up, and some that they made. And perhaps in a way, it symbolizes that I have a new life.
What memories have been important to you in your process of moving through grief?